Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Disability Policy Research Forum here at the Washington, D.C. office of Mathematica Policy Research, and also to everyone attending via webinar. My name is Jody Schimmelheide, and I'm a senior researcher at Mathematica. Today is also Take Your Child to Work Day, and you'll be happy to know that none of the presenters have brought their children to this forum. The Center for Studying Disability Policy was established in 2007 to help build the evidence base around effective disability policy. We host these forums to share our research findings so they can be used to improve disability policies and programs across the nation. The forum and presentations you'll hear today were supported with funding from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, NIDLR, through its Rehabilitation Research and Training Center, RRTC, on vocational rehabilitation practices in youth. So, to shorten that a bit, that is the NIDLR RRTC on VR practices in youth. And throughout today's presentations, you will hear vocational rehabilitation referred to as VR. This RRTC conducts research, training, and technical assistance with an eye toward modifying VR service delivery to improve the lives of transitioning youth with disabilities and their families. In particular, the center's activities seek to identify effective transition practices by investigating policies, crafting solutions, and designing actionable strategies that improve the employment and post-secondary education outcomes for transition-age youth. The center researchers hail from 5 institutions: TransCen, the University of Maryland, Mathematica Policy Research, the Institute for Community Inclusion at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the Council of State Administrators on VR, or CSA-VR. So with the overarching focus of the RRTC on VR practices in youth in mind, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the presentations today will all consider the role of VR in transition from different angles. We'll have 3 presenters today. We'll begin with Todd Honeycutt, a colleague of mine and a senior researcher at Mathematica, who will present work he did with colleagues at Mathematica and the Social Security Administration. Their work considers the long-term outcomes of VR applicants. They use data from the Rehabilitation Services Administration linked to Social Security Administration data in a way that allows them to consider the employment, earnings, and benefit receipt for youth applicants for a half dozen years following the time they seek VR services. Next, we'll hear from Ellen Fabian, a certified rehabilitation counselor and professor in the counseling psychology, school psychology, and counselor education program at the University of Maryland. She'll present joint work that she's done with Richard Lukin and others at Mathematica. Their work evaluates a model VR program that targets youth in Maryland known as the Maryland Seamless Transition Collaborative, or MSTC. In addition to describing the program's features, Ellen will present effects of MSTC on participants, including on their VR service receipt and outcomes. The third presentation is by Meg Griggle, which she conveniently let me know rhymes with giggle, which should make everybody happy. Also considers the effects of a model program serving transition-age youth. Meg is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she co-directs Think College. Her presentation will focus on transition and post-secondary programs for students with intellectual disabilities, or TIPSIDs. TIPSIDs are authorized to enable institutions of higher education to create or expand high-quality, inclusive programs for students with intellectual disabilities. Meg's presentation will consider the implication of TIPSIDs coordinating with VR agencies on service delivery and student outcomes. Each presentation will last about 15 minutes, and after those presentations are complete, Andrea Guest, the director of the Delaware Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, will provide her observations on implications of the studies as a whole. So before we get starting, I have a few reminders for the audience. First, for those in the room, it's clear that we have an in-person audience. We also have an online audience. After the presentations, we will take questions. For those participating via webinar, please submit your questions electronically through the Q&A panel on your screen at any time during today's forum, and we will alternate your questions with those from the in-person audience. Second, for those of you who are with us in DC, please silence your phones and be aware that we are video recording this event for the webinar audience, and we'll post it on our website next week. This means the back of your head and you eating may be in video, so keep that in mind if you can for the next 90 minutes. And without that, I'd like to turn it over to Todd Honeycutt.
Thanks, Jody. I'm glad to be leading off this webinar today. So I'm going to be talking about indicators of success, differences in the long-term outcomes of youth VR applicants. This is work that I've completed with my colleague Frank Martin here in the audience with me, along with Jeff Hemeter at the Social Security Administration. This is research funded through NIDLR. Jody hit most of these targets, but I do want to emphasize that the opinions expressed here are those of the authors and not of the sponsoring agencies. So for our research goals for this task, we wanted to identify the long-term outcomes for transition age VR clients. And the idea was to examine how outcomes vary across individual and agency level characteristics. And we were interested in particular in the youth educational attainment and employment status when they apply for VR services. And we thought this information would be useful for informing VR policy and practice, particularly around WIOA, or Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act activities, which a lot of VR agency staff are actively involved in right now. So for our analysis, we relied on Rehabilitation Services Administration data linked to Social Security Administration records, and that allowed us to look long-term for VR applicants. We identified over 570,000 transition age youth who were ages 14 to 24 who applied between 2004 and 2007, and were also found eligible for VR services. In addition, and so from the Rehabilitation Services Administration, we had case records about their VR activities. We were able to pull in from the Social Security Administration disability analysis file information, which provided detailed information about a youth's SSA benefits, such as Social Security disability insurance income information or supplemental security income information, as well as information from the master's earnings file. So these are annual earnings records from the IRS. We considered a lot of variables, but we focus here for this study on 3 independent variables that reflect the youth's human capital and then their human capital development as they're involved with the VR agency. The first one was whether when they applied, they received either SSI or SSDI benefits. Because we think that youth characteristics and outcomes might differ based on whether they receive SSA benefits or not. Second, we wanted to consider their educational attainment and whether they were enrolled in school at the time that they applied or whether they were working at the time that they applied, because their trajectories may be a bit different based on those characteristics. And finally, we looked at VR closure status at exit. So how successful were they with their VR experience? And we looked at these variables in relationship to 3 different outcome variables. The first were earnings in the 6th calendar year after VR application. So from the time they applied, we looked 6 years out, 6 calendar years out, to see what their level of earnings were. Then we looked at 2 measures of SSA benefit receipt. And the first one is whether if they didn't receive SSA benefits at the time that they applied, whether they eventually received it within 6 years from application. And second, for a youth who did receive SSA benefits, was there any evidence that they had benefit reductions due to work? Because that's a proxy for successful employment if their benefits were reduced. So with this table, we're showing, it's just a descriptive table showing our key outcomes for 3 different types of youth. The first column are youth without SSA benefits. That's around 420,000 youth in our sample. And just to focus on the earnings outcomes, we find that 6 years out, about 66% have earnings at a substantive level. We use $1,200 as the substantive level that reflects a quarter of coverage from SSA's view. And their mean earnings in that year was around $10,864. The other 2 columns are our 2 SSA groups. So it's youth who received SSI benefits at the time that they applied and youth who received SSDI benefits at the time that they applied. There's a small portion of youth who are in both columns because they're concurrent beneficiaries. They received both SSI and SSDI benefits. And you see that the earnings level are a lot lower for those 2 groups. It's around less than a third will have earnings 6 years out from their VR application date, and their earnings are only around a little over $3,000. So right there you see differences across these 3 groups. With the SSA outcomes, for the non-SSA group, we find that about 7% will receive either SSI or DI within 6 years. For those with SSI benefits, we're tracking whether there's any benefit reductions due to work. We find that almost half of SSI youth do, compared to 12% of the SSDI youth. Those differences reflect differences in program rules for benefit reductions. But we see that the average level of benefits foregone due to work are about the same between the 2 groups, around $2,300. So in the first slide, we were looking at differences across our SSA groups. In this slide, we're showing the education and employment categories that we use. So we combined 2 measures from the RSA 911 data to identify whether youth were enrolled in school or were working, some combination thereof. These data aren't perfect because they're administrative data. We can't identify youth who are both working and in school, so that's a gap with our analysis, but I think that's a fairly small portion for this population. So here we're looking at non-SSA youth who didn't receive SSA benefits at the time of application. We're showing the proportion who are in our different categories for employment and education. We find that almost a third of youth were enrolled in school and not working when they applied. So these are high school kids. About a third of kids are in this group. The other large group are those with a high school diploma and not working. You see that on the far right-hand side, and that's around 25%. The other large group of youth are those who are high school dropouts. They don't have a high school diploma, they aren't working, they're not in school, and that's around 15% of the population. So you see some differences here, or some variation here in these categories. Now we're looking at SSI youth, or we're adding to the picture SSI youth as the white bar, and SSDI youth as the red bar. And one of the things that's striking, to me at least, about this picture is how many more kids there are who are SSI beneficiaries or SSDI beneficiaries who come to VR already with a high school diploma and not working. So you see that on the right-hand side. Almost half, for instance, of the SSDI youth have a high school diploma, but they're not working at the time that they apply. One of the things that we looked at as we were reviewing the data were how states differed, or state agencies, how they differed among youth who come to the door, who apply for VR services. And here what we're showing is the percentage of youth enrollees who were enrolled in high school and not working. So these are high school kids, and we're showing the extremes of the distribution. So on the right, you see those states that have more or higher levels of high school enrollees as a proportion of their youth population. States like Maine, Illinois, Minnesota have half of their kids who are enrolled in high school at the time that they apply. On average, for the median agency, around 22% of kids are high school enrollees. And then you've got the agencies with very few high school enrollees, at least at this initial stage. New Mexico, Washington, D.C., Alaska, fewer than 5% of their youth are enrolled in high school at the time that they apply. You might think that this may have implications for WIOA. If they're required to work more with high school students, some states like Maine, Illinois, Minnesota may be in better positions, may have better relationships with schools than do the states that serve relatively few. But the other part of the picture is that if they're not serving one group, then they're serving another group. So there's a distribution here. And so the states where you have the states that have fewer youth who are enrolled in high school at the time of application, those are states that are serving relatively more youth who are not working but have a high school degree. And you see that here with the red bar on the right-hand side. So broadly, across our outcomes, we find that youth working at application had better long-term outcomes. So relative to high school enrolled youth with at least a high school diploma and working at VR application consistently had the best long-term outcomes. That may not be news to a lot of you, but this reflects a relatively advantaged group. Youth who enrolled in post-secondary school had somewhat better outcomes, not as high as those who were already working, but they did have typically had better outcomes than the other groups relative to the high school enrolled youth. That's important because we hear a lot that one of the key services that VR agencies can do is provide additional training and education for these youth. And youth without a high school diploma in neither working nor in school had consistently poor outcomes. This is a high school dropout group. These are youth who are relatively disadvantaged and may have additional challenges for successful transition. And what we find is that these results are consistent no matter which SSA group we look at. So I want to take you through a couple of examples. This figure, we're looking at the earnings in the 6th year after VR application for non-SSA youth who didn't have SSA benefits when they applied. We use as our reference group high school enrollees. So that's the group that we compare the other groups to. These are regression-adjusted results. High school enrollees 6 years after VR application had an average income of around $13,000, $13,314. And so you see that youth with a high school diploma who were working had an additional $4,800 controlling for other factors 6 years after application. So that's what I mean that they're in a relatively better position down the road. You also see that youth who are high school dropouts without a high school degree, not working, not in post-secondary school, they have earnings that are $1,800 less 6 years down the road. In this slide, we're looking only at SSI youth, and we're looking at two outcomes. One is earnings, that's the blue bar, and the red bar reflects benefits foregone due to work. And we see a similar kind of pattern, that relative to high school enrollees, those with a high school diploma and working had an additional $1,800 in earnings in the 6th year after application, and that's compared to $2,900 in earnings for the reference group. That group also had $1,600 in benefits foregone, or $1,600 more in benefits foregone due to work relative to the reference group. And the reference group had only $4 in benefits foregone as a comparison. The no high school diploma group, not working, not in school, they had lower earnings, $355, and less earnings, and their benefits foregone due to work were the same, or there were no differences there. And we see a similar pattern here with SSDI youth. In addition to education and employment at application, we looked at VR closure status, and we divided VR closure status into one of three categories: whether a youth was eligible for services but didn't get to plan, so they never received services, they dropped out for some reason. The second group are those who received a plan for employment, they signed a plan for employment, received services, but they were unsuccessful, they didn't close with employment. And then the third group are those who received services and were successful, they exited with employment. And we find that compared with youth who exited from VR after receiving services but without employment, we use that as our reference group, youth who exited with employment had consistently better long-term outcomes, and that youth who exited before receiving services had somewhat better outcomes than youth who received services but were unsuccessful. And though we find consistent findings across our SSA groups, youth with SSI or SSDI benefits were less likely to not be successful with VR. They were more likely to drop out, they were more likely to receive services but be unsuccessful. I want to point out a few limitations with our research. One is that there are some selection issues. This is a descriptive study. Our results are not causal, and individuals self-select to apply for VR services and to receive VR services. We had some limitations with the measures we had available in the VR data, and particularly, as I mentioned, this idea of youth who were both enrolled in school and working. We couldn't identify those. And youth received VR services for varying durations. We're using as our anchor point the time from application, but youth could have been enrolled in VR services for as little as a year or less, or 5 years or longer. In terms of VR service provision considerations, I think the first point is somewhat obvious, but I think interesting to us, that successful VR exit is associated with long-term earnings and SSA outcomes, no matter the youth's SSA status. Second, high school dropouts not working typically had among the poorest outcomes and most challenges with successful transition. And youth already working had relatively better outcomes. And this last point is that, even though we can identify outcomes for different types of youth, we still have little information on what specific VR services and programs might result in better outcomes and for specific populations. When we think about WIOA implications, I think some VR agencies could be better prepared or in a better position to deliver pre-employment transition services because they were already working with a large proportion of high school youth as part of their overall bucket of youth. Targeting in-school youth risks crowding out services to other types of youth or adults, and that's something that should be considered. And the final point here is, I think, a little bit subtle, and it's the idea that providing more services to in-school or out-of-school youth could result in different short and long-term outcomes overall for the agency, that different types of youth experience or have different trajectories. And so looking at outcomes, you might want to consider what types of youth are relevant for that. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Fabian.
interagency team designed to monitor each youth's progress with the intervention. Look, excuse me again. I feel like I'm. Okay, is that good? All right, sounds better. Okay, so two key elements, I think I already said, were at least one paid employment experience prior to school exit and a local level interagency team that I'll talk a little bit about later. The purpose of that team was to monitor each youth's progress through the intervention with the overall goal of the intervention to improve employment, post-secondary school exit, post-secondary enrollment, as well as linkages to adult services. It was really, the outcome was seamless transition. And I think that what most people say about that is that the last day of school should be the first day of work and or entry into college. The MSTC service flowchart, this is the implementation design for the MSTC model. As you can see, students were enrolled 3 years prior to school exit, and the intervention was designed over a 3-year period, with the most intensive services being offered in years 2 and 3. Work-based experiences that you see offered in the 11th grade or 2 years prior to school exit included things like volunteer, unpaid internships, job shadowing, etc. Paid employment in this model that you see offered in 1 year prior to school exit included a variety of alternatives, such as summer youth employment opportunities, paid internships in the community, etc. And of course, the goal of paid employment was integrated jobs and settings where employers paid the wage. Some services, as you can see, and I'll talk a little bit about those later, endured throughout the entire intervention, and that was family support. And then what I referred to earlier as these local interagency transition councils. MSTC was funded by a grant from the Rehabilitation Services Administration. The Division of Rehab Services, which is our VR state agency in Maryland, was the grantee, with TransCen providing the model design, the technical assistance, and the monitoring and evaluation. It is important to note that it was a competitive process through which we selected the 11 LEAs where we implemented the model. Each site enrolled, each of these 11 sites enrolled between 20 and 40 students, depending on the size of the LEA. MSTC was designed for students notwithstanding the type of disability, although I should say that some of the sites did emphasize a specialized target population, for example, youth with ID, youth with SED, certificate-bound youth, or diploma-bound youth. It is also important to note that these grant funds that were competitively awarded to each of the sites were there to cover a variety of activities that the site wanted, that the site identified in their budget, such as record keeping, travel, and they could even, and I'll get back to this later, they could even purchase additional services beyond what would be offered through vocational rehabilitation with these additional dollars. Fidelity of the model implementation was assured by several steps. 3 of the key ones, I think, were monthly meetings with the TransCen technical assistance team. So they would meet each month with the LEA representatives, and in particular with the entire interagency team that I talked about. Quarterly meetings were conducted with all of the LEAs that were involved in the implementation, as well as direct training to frontline staff. So study methods. Because MSTC was a demonstration project where students were not randomly assigned to treatment, we couldn't, to conduct the evaluation, we couldn't directly compare MSTC enrollees, MSTC students to non-MSTC students, since we assumed that there would be considerable selection bias. Therefore, we used a method called propensity score analyses to generate a comparison sample to conduct the evaluation. The comparison sample consisted of all youth in the LEAs or counties. In Maryland, an LEA and a county is the same thing, so we've got 24 counties and 24 LEAs, who were recipients of DOOR services, but who were not enrolled in MSTC over the same time frame of the study. The comparison sample was derived through this analytic procedure by matching as closely as possible the non-MSTC enrollees to those enrolled based on a number of characteristics. Some of those that we looked at were age at application, so matching finding a comparison group of in the same counties of non-MSTC youth, age of application, sex, race, disability type, SSDI and SSI enrollment and application, and the final comparison sample was matched to the MSTC sample on all of these variables. It's important to note that while these two groups were roughly equivalent, there are always a lot of factors that may have influenced a kid to enroll in the MSTC intervention that were non-observed. Motivation, desire to achieve, family encouragement and support. So, and I'll go back and talk a little bit about that later. So this is the MSTC participants. As you can see then, they veered toward being male, average age 17.6 years. So you kind of think that these were predominantly certificate-bound students since we started it 3 years prior to exit. Predominantly non-Hispanic white. 23% received SSI at VR application, and you can see the various types of the various disabilities that comprised our sample. So on to the results. Research question 1, how did MSTC students compare with non-MSTC students on VR service utilization and service cost? Here's the first chart. The x-axis on this graph, represents inverse propensity score weighted means for each of these VR services. In other words, the percent of each group who received any of the VR services identified. So if you look at the graph, about 67% of non-MSTC students received assessment services compared to about 52% of MSTC students. About 46% of MSTC students received on-the-job supports compared to 21% of non-MSTC students. Not pictured on the graph, but probably important for VR out there in our audience, for everybody really, is that about 90% of MSTC students obtained an IPE, an individual plan for employment, compared to about 74% of non-MSTC students. So they were more likely to obtain an IPE. Here, this slide summarizes those results. MSTC participants were significantly more likely to receive more job training, job search assistance, and on-the-job supports, less assessment and diagnosis. And this wasn't on the graph, but it's important to note that MSTC participants had lower overall VR service costs at about $2,700 for a MSTC student compared to close to $4,000 for the non-MSTC group. Research question 2, how did MSTC students compare with non-MSTC on VR closure outcomes? And again, this graph identifies in very simple forms, in very simple format. This one shows the difference in VR closure outcomes for MSTC versus non-MSTC students. For those whose cases were closed during the time we conducted the evaluation and retrieved the data on these students from doors, about 40% of MSTC students obtained successful VR closure or employment compared to 23% of non-MSTC students. Conversely, about 49% of students whose cases were closed as other, meaning they weren't successful closures. They didn't obtain competitive employment as compared to 34% of non-MSTC students. And again, the key findings from that slide are that MSTC participants were significantly more likely to be closed in VR with employment, less likely to be closed as other, meaning not employed, and this wasn't in the slide, earned slightly less per hour than their comparison group, 807 versus, excuse me, 860. But I just want to make a point about that. for the small subset of individuals whose cases were closed as employed and for whom we had wage data, just a caveat around that. So that difference is descriptive, but not, we didn't conduct statistical analysis on looking at the difference in wage and hours. All right, so discussion. It's clear then that the MSTC model incorporated 5 empirically supported practices, the ones that I talked about, early referral to VR, paid employment experience, interagency team, work-based learning experiences, and family support. Demonstrated better VR outcomes for less service costs. I want to make a little caveat around the less service costs, because remember I said that sites also got some funds, some competitive grant award funds, and they were allowed to use that, for example, those monies to maybe pay for a job coach at a CRP to provide additional job support. So the MSTC youth were significantly lower in VR service costs, but just a little caveat that the LEA might have had a little bit more money to purchase some of those services outside of what they would have gotten through Voc Rehab. Also important to note is that several of the MSTC services are now incorporated in WIOA. For example, pre-employment transition services, PREETs, include those work-based learning experiences that were featured in the MSTC intervention, including paid employment. WIOA also emphasizes the need for collaboration between VR and LEAs, particularly on the implementation of the 5 pre-employment transition services. And the MSTC model evaluation provides some benchmark support for that collaboration. And I'll talk as I finish up with one more study that looked at the effect of collaboration. So implications and next steps. As a result of, I think MSTC offers a guide or a template for encouraging Voc Rehab to collaborate with LEAs, as is recommended in WIOA, to authorize pre-ed services for students with disabilities. Although we didn't specifically explore which MSTC services offered the biggest bang for the buck, it is clear that vocationally oriented services such as job supports, job site training, were the VR service elements that distinguish MSTC students from non-MSTC. So it wasn't the assessment, the diagnosis, the treatment, which do run up service costs, right, in Voc Rehab. It was the vocationally oriented services that distinguish the comparison groups. Another important implication for MSTC is the interagency coordinating teams at the local level. Another study that I've got cited in the last slide here that we conducted did provide support for the efficacy of these teams in terms of their unique effect on VR service outcomes, particularly when the teams were truly focused on emphasizing coordinating services around achieving student goals. So in that other study, we looked at teams that had key instrumental functioning, meaning that they had really established very clear goals that they wanted to achieve per each student, as compared to interagency teams that more or less get together and talk about the reducing barriers, important conversations. But what we did was that those teams that had that goal-oriented instrumental functioning did have a larger effect on student VR outcomes. And finally, I want to close with saying that Maryland is one of the states that recently received a 5-year grant from RSA to DOORS, our Division of Rehab Services, and that will enable us to further refine the MSTC model and evaluate its impact using a randomized control design. And again, we're working with all the same partners in implementing that as involved in this study, so stay tuned for the results of that work. More background on MSTC. Rich Luking, my colleague, and Deborah Luking, translating research, career development and transition, gives much more description, much more rich description of it than I could present in this brief overview. And my reference to service system collaboration and an effect on VR outcomes is cited can be found in this second study that published in the Journal of Rehab. So thank you very much. And we got through the technical difficulties, and I turn it over now to Meg.
Little do-si-do. I forgot my notes. Kick it off just about right for me. So, well, hi everybody. You're such a quiet group, and that freaks me out, as do podiums. So I'm just going to put that out there. I'm Meg Griggle. I'm really good. Not working. Tell me what you want me to do. No, I'm good? It's going in and out. What if I do this? Is that better? All right, fabulous. I just won't move. Is that good? All right, wonderful. This afternoon, because as Todd and Ellen's study, Todd did a secondary analysis of existing data. It's still going in and out. Should I turn this one off? Nope. Okay. All right. Is this better and more consistent? Well, I'll just keep talking. I'll look for the happy face or the sad face. I want emojis to flash across all your faces. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. I don't know how many people here in the room or that are joining us via webinar have heard of Think College, but we are working around the country supporting people with intellectual disability to go to higher education. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background in inclusive higher education and how it's grown. As you can see from this slide, we've seen significant growth in the number of programs that we are aware of that are hosted at institutions of higher education that serve students with intellectual disability. A significant portion of those programs began right after the reauthorization of the Higher Education Opportunities Act, which was the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act in 2008. You can see the chart climbs quickly there. This data is taken from a programs database that we host at Think College. It's self-report data from programs, so it absolutely is probably missing some of the programs that exist. But if they tell us they exist, we put them in the database. So in 2008, when the Higher Education Opportunities Act reauthorized the Higher Ed Act, 3 major changes happened that really influenced access to higher ed for students with intellectual disability. The first was that act created appropriations for model demonstration projects to be funded. These programs were funded across the country through a competitive process to increase access to higher ed for students with intellectual disability. And because we work in disability, you know there's a great acronym next to them. These programs are called Transition Post-Secondary Programs for Students with Intellectual Disability, because that's very catchy. And the acronym is TIPSID. So if in your state you've heard people talk about they have a TIPSID, the TIPSIDs are the model demonstration projects, or the federally funded projects serving students with intellectual disability in higher ed. It also funded a national coordinating center to serve as a technical assistance entity and to collect evaluation data from all of the TIPSIDs, or model demonstration projects that are working. The University of Massachusetts Boston at Think College, we are the national coordinating center for the original cohort of TIPSIDs that were funded in 2010. It also created Title IV access for the first time. By that I mean access to federal student aid for students with intellectual disability. This was critical because it really changed the nature of the conversation in higher education about serving people with intellectual disability, because if they could access Title IV aid, which they previously could not because they didn't have a high school diploma and they weren't seeking to matriculate toward a post-secondary degree, this was a game changer in higher ed. So suddenly, some of these students could access Pell Grants, Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grants, and work-study funds. They could not access student loans if they were financially eligible and attending an institution that had applied to become an approved program to offer that aid. So big change, a lot of context changes here. So the National Coordinating Center, as part of our role, collected data each year on each student for every class they took, every job they had, every credential they attained. All of those data, because I know you can't wait to read these reports, are available on our website. And I'm going to be sharing today a little bit of information about a secondary analysis we did from those data. Here are where the TIPSs, or the Model Demonstration Grant projects, were funded. They were in 27, see, this is where I should have opened my notes because I knew I'd maybe forget. There were 52 campuses in 4-year and 2-year college campuses. They served 2,245 students. And in some cases, they were the only higher education option that the student had access to in the state. So in some cases, if the TIPS had not been funded, those students would have ended up in a sheltered workshop or in a rehabilitation center. Instead, they were taking college courses and either working or in career development opportunities on campus. Just to give you a sense of how many, what students did overall over the course of the funding period, which was between 2010 and 2015, there were over 23,000 enrollments in courses. 45% of those courses were into traditional college classes with peers without disability, and half of those enrollments were for credit. So these students in some cases were getting college credit, not in all cases. 846 students worked in paid jobs while also attending classes. Nearly 1,500 students were participating in pre-employment career development activities, and over 1,000 students earned a credential during the course of this model demonstration. So what am I talking about today? I know that was a really big lead up, right? So that gives you a sense of who we're talking about. And what we were looking at in this study is to what extent does partnership with vocational rehabilitation impact who gets served, how they are partnering, and what the outcomes are. So I'm just going to move us forward. And I think all these slides are available, so I hope I'm trying to stay on time. One thing to be clear about, we only looked for this secondary analysis at the 5th year of data, so the final year of the grant funding, because we felt like that would represent the strongest partnerships and the longest potential outcomes for the students. There were 38 programs that did partner with VR and 12 that did not. 606 students at partnered programs and 128 at non-VR partnered programs. So, what did they do? You can see that the primary frequency of interaction was quarterly and monthly. Many fewer were, I can tell this isn't as great, annual, biannual, or weekly. That's not a big shock right there. The thing that I think is really important as we start finding out these answers is that it leads to more questions. So my question is more frequent contact better? And we did not find that, actually. We found that the quarterly contact was actually more impactful on employment outcomes than monthly. And I think that makes sense if you think about the planning cycle for college courses and when you meet with your advisors. So I'm excited that we are starting to see some themes come out here, but I think we have more questions than answers. As you can see, the role of the VR agency varied pretty widely. Direct services to students, career development and employment opportunities, and project advisory committee member were the most frequent roles. The relationships really varied, and I'm sure those of you who are in the field right now say, well, of course they did, because interagency collaboration isn't really a thing. It's all about relationships. It's all about you collaborate with people who work at agencies. So sometimes your relationships are strong and frequent, and sometimes they're not. We did not have data on how many of these students were actual VR clients, which you know, lesson learned. That's in the system now. We're going to be capturing that data as the next set of data comes in. Some other differences that we saw in VR partnered programs is that the VR partnered programs served younger students and more students who were dually enrolled. So if you're not familiar, dually enrolled means students who are still receiving services under IDIA through their public school, but they are receiving their 2 or 3 final years of transition services on a college campus. So they may be taking classes, maybe working on or off campus, but they're not in the high school. And we had a lot more students who were dually enrolled in VR partnered programs. We also saw more racially diverse students in the programs that were partnering with VR. So I think it's interesting to start, especially in the context of WIOA, because this, the WIOA guidance wasn't finalized when these data were being collected. So they were already partnering with dually enrolled or transition-aged youth before they were charged with doing so. So financial support. Well, those programs that partnered with VR were more likely to get VR financial support for both tuition and non-tuition. This is pretty straightforward. There were some programs that said they did not partner with VR that also received some minimal financial supports for students' tuition and non-tuition expenses. But you can see it's a pretty clear-cut finding. The issue that we see is that it's not just about the money. Just getting VR funds doesn't set you up for success necessarily. And we really have seen through our interactions with both the TIPSID programs and the VR counselors that they work with that engaging in what is the purpose of the program, what are the students' goals, how can those goals be met through a higher ed context to achieve their employment outcomes. And then how to use the college campus as another community resource for employment outcomes is a really untapped resource. And I think we have some work to do around that. How am I doing on time? Yeah, I can't see the clock from here, so. You gave me 2 minutes. Oh, golly. All right. All right. Meg's speed talking. All right, so here's a big one. Inclusive course access. These programs were charged with supporting students to access typical college courses. Yet we saw an inverse relationship between the programs that partnered with VR and access to inclusive courses. So those programs that partnered with VR had a higher percentage of students who took specialized courses, which were specifically designed and attended only by students with intellectual disability, which is not really the goal of the model demonstration project. Those who did not partner with VR had a higher level of access to inclusive courses or typical courses that are offered at the college. So this is a quote from one of our TIPSID program staff. VR is more interested in paying for specialized courses at this point, and we're more interested in not having any. So there's some friction there, and I think that friction is based on the course titles. Something that is specialized and says, soft skills for employment, if that's the specialized course they've created for these students, that's going to sound more like it's going to achieve an employment outcome than English 101. But if you are a stronger communicator and a stronger writer and you can navigate successfully an English 101 course, my guess is your communication skills in any workplace setting are going to be enhanced. So it's about long-term versus short-term goals. Another quote, you know a fast closure isn't necessarily the best use of this college experience. It does take more flexibility and time for a better employment outcome. So we see this friction driving our change. In terms of career and development outcomes, not huge changes while the students were in the program. I know this is a dense chart and I'm supposed to be speed talking, so I'll just give you the headline is that while students were enrolled in the program, which is what these data show, there's slightly more students in non-partnered programs who were in unpaid career development but not a paid job. But we didn't see huge differences between the VR partnership status. Where it really changed was when the students left. That's when we really saw a huge difference in the percent of students who were not engaged in either activity after exit. And in the programs that did not partner with VR, you can see that 51%, That's a significantly large number of students who've left their college program, who are not participating in career development activities and not working. So I'm very curious as to who gets services and what they focus on and when. Credential attainment, we saw higher indices of attaining a typical credential that's issued by the higher ed institution, and more programs that offered a credential through their LEA, which makes sense because we had more students who were duly enrolled. I know you're probably trying to give me the stink eye. See, I'm just not looking. That's just the way it is. I'm really almost done. The partnership status, overall, it affected funding. It affected integration versus segregation when it came to academic choices. And it affected engagement in career development and employment at exit. So we have some big implications here, I think, about what do we think about inclusion and when we support and fund segregated learning experiences. I think we have some implications about how we can capitalize on these resources at the college campuses for employment, because many of them have strong employment staff. And there's not great guidance right now for VR counselors about when and how and should they support access to inclusive higher ed for students with ID. And as we move forward, I think guidance is really necessary, because in one state you could talk to 2 different VR counselors, and one will say, absolutely, that's a great idea, I firmly believe in this, and another one will say, no, we're not doing that. Particularly in looking at the pre-employment transition services for duly enrolled students, over 40% of the students receiving services are duly enrolled students through the TPSIDs. So we're going to keep asking questions. We're going to dig a little deeper. We're going to be doing case studies. This was a 2-part study, so we're actually creating site visits right now where we're going to be meeting with IHE professionals, VR counselors, students, and families to find out the how and the why that support these partnerships and their effectiveness. So if you have any questions, come to thinkcollege.net. We have lots more information. We just started a new VR online chat group, which I'd love for you to join. And thank you for your time and attention.
All right, thank you to all of our presenters. As a reminder for our webinar audience, please submit your questions via the Q&A panel on your screen. And now we'll hear a few remarks from Andrea Guest, the Director of Delaware Division of Vocational Rehab.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to be a discussant at the Mathematica Policy Forum on behalf of the 80 other VR directors. And just to follow up with a comment you made, we like to say if you've seen one VR agency, you've seen one VR agency. So there are a lot of differences. The presentations today focused on transitioning youth and the role that VR plays or can play to achieve employment outcomes. And as you may know, VR has a lot of new roles now as a result of WIOA, with the emphasis on both students and youth with disabilities. And there are 2 different definitions for students and youth now. And one of the primary challenges that we have is the shift in VR dollars. We are required to take 15% of our traditional VR funds and now utilize them for the 5 core pre-employment transition services. And while many of us believe this is an important and necessary change, we've seen over the years that it's critical to get youth on track with their career pathways, and that can have great benefits in the years to come. But the challenge for us has been to start all of these new services without new dollars and staff. So it really has been a fun couple of years, as though those of you in the VR agency can attest to. Some of our VR agencies have worked collaboratively with schools for many, many years, and frankly, others are new to the game. In our state, we are fortunate because we've had dedicated transition counselors in all of our public high schools for at least the past 15 years. So it's been a little bit of an easier startup for us, but that doesn't discount many of the challenges. And some of the important elements that I heard reinforced today are just the simple process of starting services earlier. We in our state have decided through PREETS to start working with students at age 14. And I heard in one of the models here that I guess they start in the sophomore year, which is great. But we felt that at 14, and we're actually in middle schools now, we have people that we call career counselors, because we want students to start thinking about what kinds of jobs they want, what they want their pathway to be, and it also helps them to choose their high school courses, which we found has a great impact on what they're going to do in their adult life. For some students, it may be deciding that they're going to go to a vocational school, or just what type of transition plan and pathway they're going to have in school really starts at age 14. And it also can influence the kind of work-based learning experiences that they're going to select. Excuse me. And one of the other important things I heard reinforced today is that students need to have at least one work-based learning opportunity before they exit school. Again, the research is being reinforced that this can lead to successful adult employment. Also, we hear that services to help students stay in school are critical. I hope my voice doesn't completely disappear. A lack of education and job experience, logically, is detrimental to future employment success. So it's really our hope that we can develop some meaningful career pathways and work experience that will help motivate students to stay in school and reach their employment goals. And we've found that in the past. Several years ago, we started looking at dropout rates with the University of Delaware. And we didn't have any research data to prove it, but we were finding that as students were participating earlier in their career pathways and goals, that the dropout rate for special ed students was declining at a greater rate than that for the general population. So we equated it to our services, although I can't prove that. Early start programs for students with the most significant disabilities, including many of those who are on SSI and DI benefits, have led to greater employment outcomes and smoother transitions. We operate a program called Early Start to Supported Employment, and this works with students who have the most significant disabilities, many of them receiving benefits. And what we do is we work with a team of VR, school staff, provider agencies, as well as the DD agency. The goal is that they have a job before they leave school. And we also reflect that to the data that Todd showed, that we were one of the states that shows that students receiving benefits do have more successful employment outcomes. A critical component, though, that I think we really need to take a look at with this population for those receiving SSI and DI is benefits counseling, both for the individual as well as their family members. And I really would love to see some further research to measure the impact of benefits counseling and employment outcomes with benefit recipients. We're not positive or sure what the correlation is. We think there can be a positive one, although sometimes we hear that benefits counseling might lead people to think that maybe they don't want to pursue employment. So I think research in that area is really necessary, and benefits counseling is really important. It's a very underfunded service that Social Security should be paying more attention to. And overall, I think we recognize that the VR system and its partner agencies, and particularly, the LEAs, need to do a better job preparing students for work. That sounds like a simple thing to say, but we're seeing now, and my agency is situated at the Department of Labor in our state, so we listen to all of the labor market information and kind of have a sense of what's tracking. And we know that employment for everyone, whether you have a disability or not, the landscape is changing. The types of jobs that are available and the skills that you need to have in order to obtain jobs are different. And I still think that in some cases we're using old methods to prepare students for 21st century careers. And we really have to, I think, rely on our post-secondary education institutions, particularly community colleges. And we need to do a better job of getting students into post-secondary opportunity and skill training, specific skill training areas. We're looking at apprenticeships now, because what we find in a lot of cases is we do a good job and we engage students and we get them through school, and then we're going out to look for a job. But sometimes we forget to talk about the employer and what the employment opportunities are out there and how those are going to match to the student's skills and abilities. So while we also have made, I think, pretty good strides for the most part in working with our schools, one of the things that we need to be looking at now in the immediate future is actually influencing and working to make sure that the reauthorization of IDIA provides, I think, incentives and accountability for LEAs to partner with the VR agencies. A lot of times, my VR transition counselors and folks on our staff that work in schools, they'll tell me they go into schools and the schools are, oh, great, you're here, go do it, talk employment. We don't know anything about employment. Well, everybody knows something about employment. So we don't want them to, even though we have this partnership through WIOA and a lot of the activities that we're doing, we really don't want to walk into the schools and say, okay, your employment, we're education, do your thing. It's only going to work in the best interest of the student if we have a good collaboration. So that is something that at CSA VR, I know I'm on a little task force now that we're collaborating with our partners in special ed to make sure that we get some teeth in IDEA that can really put accountability, and not just, we have a lot of accountability in WIOA for the VR program, but we also need it on the school side when we're talking about students. And I think some ideas for some future research, we need to take a look and track and research the next generation of students who are going to receive the pre-employment transition services, to measure the impact and also best practices to disseminate throughout VR programs. I don't think I'm saying anything new to say that the VR agencies really need good research models. We operate, when I said all VR agencies are different, a lot of us try to figure it out as we go along. And you can see this happening with WIOA. There are a lot of really good practices out there. I also chair the transition committee for CSA VR, so I get to hear from all of the agencies what they're doing, and people are trying some really creative and wonderful things, but I'm not so sure that that's how you really want to operate a new program as large and impactful as this, is to just have people out there kind of figuring it out. So the more help that all of you can help us in the research and defining and demonstrating what some good best practices are that can be shared throughout VR, I think the better off that we're going to be. So on that note, I think I'm going to close and just say I really, just look forward to moving forward the work that we're doing and the impact and new ideas that you guys can come up with and help us.
All right. Thank you very much. We are now turning to the Q&A portion of the forum, and we look forward to answering as many of the questions today that we get as time will allow. For those of you in the room, please plan to speak into the microphone so that the webinar audience can hear you. They'll be circulating after you raise your hand. Please limit yourself to one question, or I will limit you to one question. And please also state your name and affiliation. And as a reminder for those attending online, please continue to submit your questions via the Q&A panel. Are there any questions in the room to start? The microphone is coming to you.
Do you want to take a web question if you've got one?
She's quick.
Oh. Hi, I'm Kirsten Rowe with the General VR Agency in Virginia. And okay, fine, only one question. I could spend hours talking with each of the panelists. Thank you all so much for really interesting information. Following along with Andrea Guest's comment about accountability for VR and specifically the new program performance measures that substantially shift our focus from getting quick closures to getting closures where people can stay employed for a long time and they're earning good wages. Obviously, that's been important to VR for a long time, but this is a major shift in our performance accountability that I believe will have changes in how we do business in VR. I'm wondering to what extent you'll be in a position, especially for those of you who are doing new research projects, will be in a position to look at the influence of those shifts in what VR has to be accountable for in evaluating the impact of the new work that you're doing. So I guess this is especially a question for Ellen and Meg.
Question for you.
No.
Data analytics.
Do you have, is your mic on?
Todd too.
Yeah. I was gonna say because one of the other RRTC studies they're doing is kind of related to that. But yeah, I mean that is a great question. And thinking about the accountability and the performance indicators, I'm thinking about it now. Somewhat through the RRTC work, but a lot through these new RSA Disability Innovation Fund projects that really are going to give us fantastic opportunities, I think, to look at in a rigorous way, to get back to what Andrew was saying, to look at some of the effects of WIOA on particularly some of the, we're looking at it from the standpoint of students with disabilities with IEPs in school. So I think that we look forward to some of that work. We're just now getting that off the ground. But input from CSAVR, the Maryland project is a collaboration with CSAVR. So looking for their input to tell us exactly that in terms of, well, look at this as one of your potential either benchmarks or intermediate or long-term impacts or outcomes from the study as you're just launching them. So we look forward to that, and Mathematica is working with us on that new project, and so either certainly tapping individually some of the state VR agencies, or most likely through CSAVR, perhaps through the committee, the transition committee, to get some input and some feedback on the designs that we're moving forward with, and particularly the outcomes and outcomes that we are incorporating into our work. I don't know, Todd, if you've got.
Yeah, I think I wanted to take it a little differently. In that,
Okay, sure.
well, I mean, it builds on what you said, but these are really opportunities, right? And opportunities are double-edged swords. But I think about students, and I think about youth, and I think about the working age population with disabilities. And these new measures give you opportunities to track different outcomes for these different groups, right? The standard for just being employed for 90 days may not be the best standard for all of these populations. And so depending on the different programs and types of services that a VR agency delivers, these new performance measures really give you opportunities to track what's working, in different areas. And some things may not result in successful closures with employment, with high wages, jobs with high wages, but skills gain could be just as important, especially in that long run. And one of the things that I feel has hampered VR agency studies with administrative data is this emphasis on closure. and only having outcomes at closure. And having these outcomes 2 quarters, 4 quarters down the road in different kinds of dimensions to outcomes, I think will be, it's a rich opportunity for VR agencies to capitalize on.
One thing I didn't mention earlier is that the first cohort of TIPSIDs were funded between 2010 and 2015. There was a second cohort of model demonstration projects funded in 2015. There are 25 new grantees that will partner with 43 additional IHES over the next 5 years. So being the National Coordinating Center, we got the opportunity to look back at the data collection instrument that we had designed in 2011 and had to go through OMB approval and redesign it and change what we asked. And one of the things, because WIOA had just recently been authorized and then the regulations had passed, we built in some questions into that instrument. Is this student receiving pre-employment transition services? Are they a VR client? So things that we hadn't put in the earlier data set. So I'm hopeful that over the next 4.5 years, we can collect some data that gives us a little bit of information about who's using it, where it's being effective, tying it into outcomes. We were also authorized to collect outcome data, which we hadn't been allowed to collect. We weren't allowed to collect data past 90 days at exit. So now we can look at exit data or outcome data a year out and then annually thereafter, at least through the funding cycle. So I think we will have, it's a small piece of the puzzle because so few students have access to post-secondary education. But I encourage all of you, and I want to follow up on what Andrea said, as IDEA, if it gets reauthorized, I think mimicking our language in higher education reauthorization, HEOA, WIOA, IDEA, and ESSA, I think we have to say the same message in all of them, and we have to have the same measures. So if VR agencies have to collect pre-employment transition data, I think LEAs should have to acknowledge that they are partnering and who's receiving those services and how they're tying them into their IEP and their transition goals. So I would hope that all of those legislative guidances would coalesce.
Right. For the sake of time, can we try? I imagine there's webinar questions?
Yes. This question comes from Jen Rigger. It's for Meg. When will you begin to measure outcomes of employment and earnings in TIPSID programs? Is there an evaluation of these metrics planned?
There is, and actually we just launched the first year of our second cohort of data. We spent creating the new system, getting it approved by OMB, and then training all the new TIPSIDs on how to use it. So we have 1 year of data for their first year. We've just launched our follow-up data protocol, and because you know what? Getting data from college students who've left, kind of difficult. So we've taken a lot of time to create measures for the program staff to work with families and exiting students that is respectful of their time, that is easy to use, that is engaged with our existing system. So we will be collecting the first year of follow-up data this coming. We launched it this month. We have plus 2 months for 90-day exit, and so plus or minus 1 month on either side of exit, and then plus 2 months for 1 year data. So within a 4-month period, just so that the data was somewhat similar, collected at a similar time. So we hope that we will have a good amount of data to look at. My guess is it's going to take a while. By the end of the 5 years, I hope we have enough to say something strong.
Can I just add something to that? With wage data, if they are VR clients, we do have access to UI wage data that we can help getting information if they are a VR client. But the other ones, I'm not sure if you can do an agreement to access that.
Yeah, we could look at a data sharing agreement.
All right, let's take a question from the audience in-house.
Hi, Gina Livermore from Mathematica, and this question's for Meg again. You had to flip through your last slides really quickly, but I'm interested in the one that you had about the credential attainment of the students and what the difference is. If you could just give a little bit of flavor of what they mean, because I don't really understand except the one that's available to all IHE students. I could probably, but not exactly which types of things were most common for this population. And it would just be interesting to have a little flavor around that.
A little color, sure. So the credentials that the TIPSIDs are offering to the students who attend, they were all obligated through their grant agreement to award a meaningful credential. Well, if more nebulous words have ever been created. And then to add to that guidance, the meaningful credential was determined by the IHE. So the applicant could decide what the meaningful credential was. So there was a range of credentials. In some cases, the IHE that received the TIPSID grant looked at their existing credentials and aligned the credential, the course of study with an existing credential and offered TIPSID students access to that credential. In other cases, they created a specialized TIPSID-only credential, and the students could achieve that credential. There was typically a course of study aligned with it, but it wasn't recognized by the institution that provided it. And even those credentials that were recognized by the institution that provided it weren't necessarily recognized by other institutions or by employers. So a meaningful credential is a really important piece of the TIPSID puzzle that we're grappling with right now, because our guidance was that they needed to attain a center-developed, department-approved credential. Well, I don't know about your college, but I've never met a college that says, sure, you develop a credential and then we'll give it to people. So we can't develop a credential for them, and the department doesn't approve credentials. So we're working through that. We're trying to get more meaning in the meaningful credentials, but it's a long-term process, and I think we really have to look at state policies when it comes to credential attainment. I think there's huge opportunities because most students without disability can't access federal student aid to attain a vocational credential at their local community college. But guess who can? Students with intellectual disability can get Pell Grants to go to Howard Community College and attain, if the college has been approved as a comprehensive transition program. So I think we have a lot of potential in credentials, but right now it's either a specialized credential, a typically available credential, or sometimes their culminating documentation is what they receive from their LEA because they're still transitioning youth.
All right.
That's enough.
Okay. Let's take another question from the web audience.
Yes, this question comes from Beverly Kroll with the Arizona Department of Child Safety, and it's directed to the whole group. Were any of the youth served in the programs in foster care? And if so, did outcomes differ? And did you find there were other implications for services?
In the work that I do using administrative data, we don't have any information on youth who are in foster care. And I do know that that's a big issue with, duly enrolled or, multiple system involved youth. I think about, criminal justice involved youth being a particularly important category that we just don't have information on their use of these kinds of services. We can't track them. We can't see what their outcomes are. And that's a real gap.
Yeah, I think through Progress we probably have some information on that. That would be,
I mean, I can tell you as a VR agency, we serve a lot of youth who are in foster care. It's just, that's just not the only identifying characteristic. They have to be in foster care and have a qualifying disability. And I'm sure throughout VR agencies, they are served. We do, I believe, track if they're in foster care, but I don't know that we've ever analyzed that data or done any research in that area. But we make a special effort to reach out to students who have been identified as in foster care and also have a disability.
We have a question. One in the room. Let's start with Frank.
Thank you. I'm Frank Martin from Mathematica. I wanted to ask a question to Ellen about the Mystic project. Can you tell us a bit about the VR service providers, the counselors? Were they aware of the status of the youth they were serving? Were they aware of the project? And in the new RC2 that you're planning, are they going to be aware as well or not?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, in Mystic, they and this is because the grant award was to the state VR agency. Each VR counselor in the selected LEA site was a member of the interagency transition team. So yes, the counselor was aware of the program, and we talked a little bit about that in terms of being a part of that team, in terms, probably we hope in a beneficial way, would have influenced their overall practices in terms of early engagement with VR. That was such a central part of the Mystic model, these work-based learning experiences. So we have no real way to measure that objectively, but they were definitely aware of the students who were enrolling in Mystic, and a central part of those teams. In the new project that we're just launching, it's going to it is going to be the unit of analysis will be the unit of implementation will once again be the LEA for Maryland at least. And the VR counselors are going to be very involved on the same sort of structural interagency teams that we're modeling after Mystic, so they will be aware of it.
Right. We do have another question from the web.
We do. It's lengthy, so let me. It's from Chan Stroman, and it's for Meg. Your description of Delaware's DVR's work and services in schools, career counselors in middle schools, work-based learning connections are great ideas and tie in well with IEP post-secondary transition planning work that should be happening at the same time. It sounds like a great example of cross-section collaboration that is supposed to be happening under WIOA, but has been challenging in real-world implementation. Would you be able to speak to this issue in more detail or point me to where I can find more information?
If they want specific information about the program that we're doing, I mean, I'd be happy, if they can contact me, I'd be happy to give them more. But overall, I would say one of the things that states have to do or agencies have to do is first you have to build that partnership with Department of Education. And it starts with, sounds basic, but just actually meeting the people and getting to know them. We found when we informally surveyed a lot of our VR agencies as they were getting ready to do pre-employment transition, as I said before, some people were already engaged with their education folks and some were not at all and were just at the introductory stage. After you get past that, you've got to develop a good working MOU, and that is going to guide your path. But I think the reason that we've been successful in this area is that we've been able, over the course of many years, to develop a really solid partnership with our ed folks. We work in tandem. We just finished a 2-day planning session that NTACT facilitated for us, and we had the director of career and tech ed there who's totally engaged in what we're doing now and helping us identify the clusters for our career planning for our students, because we took the idea too that, I mean, we have, and I come from, obviously, Delaware's a very small state, but we've identified from 14 to 21, there are about 10,000 students who potentially could utilize our services. So for us to be able to reach that many students through pre-ETs would be probably impossible, if not a great challenge. So we did target working with 14-year-olds, but also we still have engaged, we have our transition counselors who are already there, so once they get to that point, they can shift over to actually working with them, where then their employment plan is open. but you really have to have the buy-in of the ed folks. We decided after that planning session we're going to do 3 pilot sites in our middle schools, and they're actually going to fund and facilitate those. So developing that partnership, and in another state it may be that you're going to do a different kind of program, but you have to have that collaborative working relationship as well as an MOU. So that's in place. So if the players leave, you want to continue to be able to do that work. But as far as our specific program, our early starts to support employment or the career counseling model that we're just starting to implement, I'd be happy to give specific information if they want to contact me.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. Do you still have your question? Excellent. All right.
I can actually save you a minute at the end. I want to call attention to our next forum, which is on June 22nd. And one of the presentations is going to be by Heinrich Hock, who's going to talk about a study we just completed of Job Corps. And I think it has very exciting evidence that Job Corps is a service that can help youth with disabilities. And I'm wondering, so anyway, I'd like to encourage people to be there, but I'm wondering whether any of the agencies you've been affiliated with have ever used Job Corps as a way to serve your clients. And particularly you, Andrea, I know you're in the Department of Labor or Employment Security, whatever it is, whether Job Corps has ever reached your attention that way.
I know that our VR counselors do refer young people to Job Corps, that they have made those connections. How many or how effective, that I couldn't tell you, but I absolutely know that they do make referrals.
We don't have those data, but I would be curious to see if any of the TIPSs are partnering with Job Corps.
All right. Well, thanks to all the presenters for really engaging presentations. And thank you for those in the room and those on the webinar for joining us today. Please let us know what you think by completing the electronic survey. For those of you that are on the webinar, you should have access to that now. For those of you in person, you will receive that, I think, in your email soon. And since Dave stole my last remark, one thing I will say is to don't forget to mark your calendars for the Disability Research Consortium annual meeting that's taking place in Washington, D.C. on August 2nd, because everybody likes to come to D.C. in August. Thanks very much.